They say blood is thicker than water. But I learned that winter morning that some blood can freeze colder than the snow that nearly killed me. My name is Gloria Bennett, and I'm 74 years old. For most of my life, I believed that loving someone meant giving them everything you had, even if it meant having nothing left for yourself. I thought that being a mother meant sacrificing until there was nothing left to sacrifice. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about one thing. I raised a son who would leave his own mother to die in a blizzard. What he didn't know was that this mother had claws sharper than the winter wind and a bite that could freeze his entire world with just one phone call. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that people will show you their true colors when they think you're powerless. When they think you're just another helpless old woman who doesn't understand the modern world, who doesn't know about technology or money or the way business really works. They see your wrinkled hands and your silver hair, and they think you're fragile. They think you're foolish. They think you're forgotten. But sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sometimes, the quiet grandmother in the corner is the one holding all the cards. This is my story. This is about the day my son learned that his mother wasn't the woman he thought she was. This is about the moment when 43 years of motherhood crashed against the bitter reality of who I had raised. This is about what happens when unconditional love meets conditional loyalty, and what a mother does when she discovers that her greatest creation is also her greatest disappointment. My story begins long before that frozen morning, long before I found myself abandoned on railroad tracks with nothing but the clothes on my back and a phone call that would change everything. It begins 37 years ago, in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and broken dreams, where I first laid eyes on a 6-year-old boy who would become my son. I was 37 then, considered old for adoption by the standards of the time. My husband, Robert, and I had tried for years to have children of our own, but fate had other plans. We had just buried our third miscarriage when our lawyer called about Michael. He had been in the system for 2 years, bouncing between foster homes like a pinball in a machine that never stopped playing. His biological parents had lost their rights after a series of neglect charges, and he was what they called a difficult placement, too old for most families, too hurt to trust easily. The first time I saw Michael Anthony Bennett, soon to be Michael Anthony Bennett, he was sitting in a plastic chair that was too big for his small frame, swinging his legs and staring at a worn copy of a children's book. His hair was longer than it should have been, dark brown like coffee grounds, and when he looked up at me with those green eyes, I saw something that broke my heart in the most beautiful way. I saw intelligence mixed with wariness, hope battled with fear, and underneath it all, a loneliness that echoed my own. Robert was hesitant. He worried about taking on a child who already had so much history, so much baggage. But I looked at Michael, and I saw possibility. I saw a boy who needed someone to believe in him, someone to show him that not everyone would leave, that not everyone would fail him. I saw a son. The adoption process took 8 months. 8 months of home visits and psychological evaluations, and court dates that seemed to stretch on forever. But finally, on a Tuesday morning in October, Michael came home with us. He carried everything he owned in a single duffel bag that had seen better days, and he sat in the back seat of our car staring out the window like he was memorizing the route in case he needed to find his way back. Those first few years were not easy. Michael had nightmares that would wake the entire neighborhood. He hoarded food in his bedroom, convinced that meals were temporary gifts that could be taken away at any moment. He tested us constantly, pushing boundaries and breaking rules, waiting for us to give up on him like everyone else had. But we didn't give up. I didn't give up. I threw myself into mothering with the desperation of someone who had waited too long for the chance. I learned to braid hair from YouTube videos when Michael went through a phase of wanting to look like his female teacher. I coached his little league team when no other parent would volunteer. I spent countless nights helping him with homework, not because he couldn't do it himself, but because I wanted him to know that someone cared enough to sit with him while he struggled. Robert was a good father, but he was busy building his accounting practice, working long hours to provide for our new family. It was me who attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every doctor's appointment. It was me who stayed up all night when Michael had pneumonia, holding him while he coughed and stroking his hair until the fever broke. It was me who taught him to drive, who helped him through his first heartbreak, who celebrated every small victory like it was the greatest achievement in human history. By the time Michael was in high school, you would never have known he hadn't been born into our family. He was charming and intelligent, popular with his classmates and beloved by his teachers. He played varsity basketball and was president of the student council. He dated the homecoming queen and won a scholarship to the state university. Everyone said we had done such a wonderful job raising him, that we should be so proud of how he had turned out. And I was proud. God help me, I was so proud of that boy that it hurt sometimes. When he walked across the stage at graduation, when he gave his valedictorian speech about overcoming adversity and the power of family, I cried tears that had been building up for 12 years. This was my son, my miracle, my proof that love could conquer anything. College was harder. Michael was 3 hours away, and for the first time since he had come home with us, I couldn't be there to help him navigate the difficulties. He called less frequently, came home less often. Robert said this was normal, that all children pulled away from their parents as they grew up, but I felt the distance like a physical ache. It was during his sophomore year that Michael called, with what he described as a small problem. He had gotten involved with some friends in a business venture that had gone badly. They had borrowed money to invest in what they thought was a sure thing, but the deal had fallen through, and now they owed more than they could pay. The amount was $12,000, which might as well have been $12 million to a college student. I didn't hesitate. Robert and I had been saving for years, living below our means and putting money aside for emergencies. This felt like exactly the kind of emergency we had been preparing for. I wired the money that same day, and Michael's relief was so palpable over the phone that I felt like I was breathing easier myself. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 20 years of our relationship. Michael would call with a problem. I would solve it with money. Sometimes it was a legitimate crisis, a car accident, a medical bill, a job that fell through. Sometimes it was an opportunity, a business idea, an investment opportunity, a chance to buy into something that could change his life. Each time, I said yes. Each time I told myself that this was what mothers did, that this was how love worked. After college, Michael moved to the city and got a job with a marketing firm. He was good at his work. He had always been good at understanding what people wanted to hear, at making them believe in whatever he was selling. Within 5 years, he had been promoted twice and was making more money than Robert and I had ever dreamed of. But somehow, it was never enough. The calls kept coming. He needed money for a down payment on a better apartment in a better neighborhood. He needed money to buy a car that would impress his clients. He needed money to take his girlfriend on a vacation to Italy because she was the one. Mom, she was really the one. And he wanted to propose to her in Rome. I gave him everything he asked for. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack when Michael was 28, I gave him even more. The grief was overwhelming, and Michael was the only family I had left. He had become the center of my universe, the reason I got up in the morning, and the last thing I thought about before I went to sleep. Michael did marry that girlfriend, a lovely woman named Sarah who worked as a nurse and seemed to genuinely care about him. Their wedding was beautiful, held at a country club that cost more than most people's houses, but I didn't mind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wanted my son to have everything he had missed out on as a child. all the stability and security and abundance that had been denied to him in those first 6 years. The grandchildren came next. First Emma, then Tyler, then little Sophie. Each of them was perfect in their own way, and I loved them with the fierce intensity that only grandmothers understand. I spoiled them outrageously, buying them everything their hearts desired and then some. I opened college funds for each of them, contributing thousands of dollars every year so that they would never have to worry about paying for their education. Michael's business ventures became more ambitious as the years went on. He left the marketing firm to start his own company, then sold that company to start another one. He dabbled in real estate, in technology, in import-export businesses that I never quite understood, but always supported. Every venture required capital, and I was always there to provide it. By the time Michael turned 40, he owned 3 companies, 2 houses, and a portfolio of investments that made him look like a very successful man. What most people didn't know was that almost everything he owned had been purchased with money I had given him, money I had earned through careful investing and frugal living over the course of my entire adult life. I had started working part-time, when Michael was in high school, doing bookkeeping for small businesses in our town. After Robert died, I turned that part-time work into a full-time career, and I was good at it. I had a natural head for numbers and an intuitive understanding of how money worked. I invested wisely, saved aggressively, and lived simply so that I could continue to support my son's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, a woman who had never owned a business or made a corporate deal in my life, was the one funding the empire that made my son look like a mogul. But I didn't mind. This was what I had wanted for him from the moment I first saw him in that courtroom, a life without limits, without the fear of not having enough, without the insecurity that had marked his early years. I told myself that I was investing in his future, that eventually he would be successful enough to stand on his own, that all the money I had given him would come back to me in the form of security and comfort in my old age. But deep down, I think I knew that wasn't true. Deep down, I think I knew that I was buying something much more precious and much more fragile than financial security. I was buying love. The warning signs were there, if I had chosen to see them. Michael called less frequently as he got older, and when he did call, it was usually because he needed something. He visited for holidays but always seemed distracted, always had one eye on his phone and one foot out the door. Sarah would try to include me in conversations, but Michael would find excuses to cut visits short or to avoid family gatherings altogether. When I turned 70, I threw myself a small birthday party at my house. I invited Michael and his family, along with a few friends from church and some of the neighbors I had grown close to over the years. Michael arrived 2 hours late, citing a business emergency, and left before we cut the cake, citing another business emergency. I made excuses for him to the other guests, explaining how important and busy he was, how much responsibility he carried. But that night, alone in my house, with the leftover cake and the deflated balloons, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt lonely. Not the temporary loneliness that comes from missing someone who will return, but the deep, existential loneliness that comes from realizing that the person you love most in the world doesn't prioritize loving you back. I pushed the feeling down, told myself I was being dramatic, that this was just what happened when children grew up and had lives of their own. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each canceled dinner, each rushed phone call, each request for money that came without an accompanying request for advice or companionship. The final straw came 6 months before that terrible day at the railroad tracks. I had been having some health issues, nothing serious, just the usual aches and pains that come with being in your 70s, and I had mentioned to Michael that I was nervous about living alone. I wasn't asking to move in with him, wasn't asking for anything drastic. I was just hoping he might call more often, check in on me, maybe help me find someone to do some of the heavier housework. His response was swift and decisive. He had found a wonderful facility where I could live with people my own age, where I would have access to medical care and social activities, and wouldn't have to worry about maintaining a house. The Sunset Manor Assisted Living Facility was, according to the brochure he sent me, a place where seniors could live their best lives while receiving the care and support they needed. I was horrified. I wasn't ready for an assisted living facility. I was still driving, still cooking my own meals, still managing my own finances. I was lonely, not incapacitated. But when I tried to explain this to Michael, he became impatient. He talked about liability and peace of mind and what would happen if I fell and no one found me for days. He made it sound like moving to Sunset Manor was the only responsible choice, the only way to ensure my safety and his peace of mind. The more I resisted, the more insistent he became. He started calling me stubborn and unreasonable. He suggested that I was being selfish, that I wasn't thinking about how much he worried about me. He even implied that my reluctance to move was a sign that I was losing my mental faculties, that I wasn't capable of making good decisions for myself anymore. That hurt more than anything else he could have said. I had spent my entire adult life making good decisions, careful decisions, decisions that had allowed me to support him and his dreams for more than 2 decades. I had built a comfortable life for myself through hard work and smart investing, and I wasn't ready to give that up just because it would be more convenient for my son. The argument went on for weeks. Michael would call and pressure me to sign the papers for Sunset Manor. I would refuse and try to explain why I wanted to stay in my own home. The conversations became increasingly tense, with Michael becoming more forceful and me becoming more hurt and confused by his insistence. Finally, Michael suggested a compromise. He would take me to lunch, and we would visit Sunset Manor together. He would show me that it wasn't the grim institution I was imagining, that it was actually a vibrant community where I could be happy. If I still didn't want to move after seeing it, he would drop the subject. I agreed, partly because I was tired of fighting, and partly because I hoped that spending time together, just the two of us, might help us reconnect. I missed my son. I missed the relationship we used to have, the easy companionship and mutual respect that had defined our interactions for so many years. I thought that maybe if we could just talk, really talk, we could work through this disagreement and find a solution that made both of us happy. I spent the morning of our lunch date getting ready with more care than I had taken in months. I wanted to look my best, to show Michael that I was still vital and capable, still the mother he could be proud of. I wore my best dress, the navy, blue one with the pearl buttons that he had always said made me look elegant. I did my hair and put on makeup, and even wore the diamond earrings that Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. When Michael arrived to pick me up, I was waiting by the window, excited to spend the day with him. He looked handsome and successful in his expensive suit and polished shoes, and I felt a familiar surge of pride. This was my son, my achievement, my legacy. Whatever problems we were having, we could work through them. We were family. I had no idea that I was looking at my son for what might be the last time. I had no idea that the man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for was planning, something that would change everything between us forever. I had no idea that in a few hours I would be fighting for my life on a set of abandoned railroad tracks, learning exactly what my 43 years of motherhood had bought me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the car ride, about the conversation that should have warned me what was coming, about the moment when I first realized that the son I thought I knew was a stranger wearing a familiar face. We drove through town slowly, Michael commenting on the changes that had happened since he was young. The old movie theater had been torn down and replaced with a chain restaurant. The park where he used to play basketball had new equipment and fresh paint. The high school had added a new wing and a bigger parking lot. Everything looked the same but different, familiar, but somehow wrong. Michael seemed relaxed, almost cheerful as he pointed out these changes. He asked about my neighbors, about the women from church, about the small details of my daily life that he usually didn't have time to discuss. I was pleased by his attention, by his apparent interest in my world. I thought this was progress, a sign that we were moving past our disagreement about Sunset Manor. It wasn't until we turned onto the highway leading out of town that I realized we weren't heading toward the restaurant where Michael had said we would have lunch. When I asked him about it, he said he had changed his mind, that he wanted to show me something first. He was being mysterious about it, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. The highway stretched ahead of us, empty and gray under the overcast sky. Snow had been forecast for later in the day, and I could see the heavy clouds building on the horizon. I suggested that maybe we should turn back, that we could visit wherever. He wanted to take me another day when the weather was better, but Michael just kept driving, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression calm and focused. That's when he started talking about the future, about how difficult it was for him to worry about me living alone, about how much easier it would be for everyone if I was somewhere safe, somewhere he didn't have to constantly wonder if I was okay. He talked about getting older, about the reality of aging, about the importance of planning ahead. I listened to him speak, and I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. This wasn't the voice of a son who was concerned about his mother's welfare. This was the voice of a man who had made a decision and was now justifying it to himself. This was the voice of someone who had already chosen his path and was simply explaining why he had no other choice. The road stretched on, and Michael kept talking, and I began to understand that I was not being taken to lunch. I was being taken somewhere else, somewhere that had been chosen for reasons I didn't want to think about. I began to understand that the son I had raised and loved and sacrificed for had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could smile while leading his mother into a trap she couldn't see but could somehow sense. The snow started falling just as we turned off the highway onto a road I had never seen before. Small flakes at first, then bigger ones, then a steady curtain of white that made the world outside the car seem to disappear. Michael turned on the windshield wipers, and they beat a steady rhythm against the glass, like a countdown to something I couldn't name but was beginning to fear. That was when I knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of loving someone, that my son was taking me somewhere I didn't want to go, for reasons I couldn't yet understand. That was when I knew that everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about his love for me, about the man I had raised, was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. The car kept moving through the snow, carrying me toward a reckoning I hadn't seen coming and wasn't prepared for. But I had my purse in my lap, and in that purse was my phone. And in that phone were numbers that Michael didn't know about, connections he had never suspected, power he had never imagined. His quiet, generous mother possessed. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover that 43 years of loving someone who didn't love you back was an expensive education. I was about to learn that the son I had created was also the son who would try to destroy me. And I was about to find out exactly what a mother's love looks like when it's been frozen solid by betrayal. The abandoned railroad tracks appeared through the swirling snow like something from a nightmare I never knew I was capable of having. Michael pulled the car off what could barely be called a road, more like a path that maintenance crews had forgotten decades ago. The tires crunched over frozen gravel and dead weeds, and when he finally stopped the engine, the silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had ended. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands folded over my purse, trying to process what I was seeing. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bare trees whose branches looked like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The railroad tracks stretched in both directions until they disappeared into the snow, and I could see from the rust and the weeds growing between the ties that no train had passed this way in years. Michael turned off the engine but didn't move, to get out of the car. He sat there for a moment, his hands still on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the falling snow. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than it had been during the drive. The false cheerfulness was gone, replaced by something flat and cold that I had never heard from him before. "Mom?" he said, still not looking at me. "We need to talk." Those 4 words sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I had heard those words before, in courtrooms and hospitals and funeral homes, and they never preceded anything good. They were the words people used when they were about to change your life in ways you wouldn't want it changed. "Here?" I asked, gesturing toward the desolate landscape around us. "Michael, this doesn't look like a safe place to stop. Maybe we should find somewhere warmer to have our conversation." He finally turned to look at me, and what I saw in his face made my breath catch. This wasn't my son, the boy I had raised and loved and protected for 37 years. This was a stranger wearing Michael's features, someone who looked at me with the cold calculation of a person solving a problem rather than the warmth of a child speaking to their mother. "This is perfect, actually," he said. "It's private. No one will interrupt us here." The way he said those words, with such deliberate emphasis, made me understand that privacy wasn't about having an intimate conversation. Privacy was about doing something that couldn't be witnessed, something that required isolation and secrecy. My heart started beating faster, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with anxiety. But this was different. This was fear. "Michael, I don't understand what's happening here. You said we were going to lunch and then to visit Sunset Manor. This doesn't look like either of those places." He smiled then, but it wasn't the smile I remembered from his childhood, the one that had melted my heart 1,000 times when he was in trouble and trying to charm his way out of consequences. This smile was something else entirely, something that made me want to look away but couldn't. "Change of plans, Mom. I've been thinking about our situation, about the conversations we've been having, and I've realized that we've been approaching this all wrong. You don't want to move to Sunset Manor voluntarily, and I understand that. I really do. But the thing is, what you want isn't really the issue anymore." "What do you mean?" He turned in his seat to face me fully, and I could see snowflakes caught in his dark hair, could see the way his breath formed small clouds in the increasingly cold air inside the car. "I mean that I've been trying to be respectful of your wishes, trying to convince you to do what's best for everyone. But I'm done with that approach. You're going to Sunset Manor, Mom. Today. The papers are already signed." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What papers? I never signed anything." "You didn't have to. I have power of attorney. I've had it for 3 years, remember? You signed it when you had that scare with your blood pressure, when you were worried about what would happen if you had a stroke and couldn't make decisions for yourself. You said you trusted me to take care of everything." I did remember signing that document. It had been after a particularly frightening episode where my blood pressure had spiked and I had ended up in the emergency room, confused and disoriented. Michael had been so concerned, so attentive, insisting that we needed to plan for any eventuality. The lawyer had explained that the power of attorney would only go into effect if I became incapacitated, and Michael had assured me it was just a precaution, just a way to make sure I was protected. "But I'm not incapacitated," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." "Are you, though?" Michael's tone was conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more terrifying. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're an elderly woman who's becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid. You refuse to accept help when it's offered. You make poor financial decisions. You're forgetting things, becoming confused about simple matters. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you balanced your checkbook correctly? When was the last time you remembered to take your medication without someone reminding you? When was the last time you had a conversation that didn't involve you complaining about something or asking for money?" Each question was like a slap, and I felt myself recoiling from words that were designed to wound, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and capabilities. But even as part of me wanted to defend myself, to argue against his characterizations, another part of me was focused on something else entirely. Michael had never seen me balance my checkbook. He had never been present when I took my medication. He had never been involved in my financial decisions enough to know whether they were good or bad. He was lying. He was creating a narrative. That justified what he had already decided to do, painting me as incompetent and deteriorating so that his actions would seem reasonable, even necessary. The realization was like a light being turned on in a dark room, illuminating corners I hadn't known existed. "You've been planning this," I said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been trying to avoid this," he replied. "I've been hoping you would come around on your own, that you would see reason and agree to the move voluntarily. But you're too stubborn, too set in your ways to do what's best for everyone." "Everyone? Or just you?" His mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something underneath that made my blood run cold. I saw calculation. I saw impatience. I saw a man who had grown tired of pretending to care about anyone's needs but his own. "Let's be honest, Mom. You're becoming a burden. Sarah is tired of having to check on you all the time. The kids are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why Grandma lives alone when she's so old. And I'm tired of worrying about what kind of trouble you're going to get yourself into next." "What trouble? I haven't gotten into any trouble." "Haven't you? What about last month when you called me in a panic because you thought someone was trying to break into your house and it turned out to be the meter reader? What about the time you got lost driving to the grocery store you've been shopping at for 20 years? What about all the times you've called me at work, crying about some imaginary crisis that turned out to be nothing?" I stared at him, trying to reconcile this version of events with my own memories. Yes, I had called him when I heard someone outside my house at night, but it had been reasonable to be cautious. Yes, I had taken a wrong turn once and ended up confused about my location, but I had figured it out and gotten home safely. Yes, I had called him when I was upset about various things, but wasn't that what family was for? He was taking normal moments of uncertainty and concern, the kind that anyone might experience, and twisting them into evidence of incompetence and decline. He was rewriting our history to suit his current purposes, and the casual cruelty of it took my breath away. "So, what happens now?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my chest. "Now you wait here while I go call for help. My car has been having some trouble lately, and it looks like it's finally given up on me. I'll walk back to the main road and use my phone to call for assistance. Someone will come pick us up, and we'll go straight to Sunset Manor. Your room is already prepared, and your belongings will be moved there over the next few days." I felt something inside me go very still, the way small animals must feel when they realize they're being hunted. "You're going to leave me here? In this weather?" "Just for a little while. I'll be as quick as I can, but it might take some time to get through to someone and explain our location. You'll be fine in the car. Keep the doors locked and stay warm." "Michael, the temperature is dropping. The snow is getting heavier. What if something happens? What if your phone doesn't work? What if no one can find us?" He was already reaching for the door handle. "Mom, you're catastrophizing again. This is exactly the kind of thinking that proves you need professional care. I'll be back soon with help. Don't leave me here." The words came out sharper than I intended, with an edge of panic that I couldn't quite suppress. "Please, Michael, if you're really concerned about my safety, then don't leave me alone in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm." He paused with his hand on the door, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Doubt, maybe, or guilt. But when he looked at me again, his expression was resolved. "I have to, Mom. It's the only way to get us out of here. Then I'll come with you." "No." His voice was sharp now, authoritative in a way that reminded me of how he spoke to his employees when they questioned his decisions. "You'll stay here where it's warm and safe. I can move faster on my own." He opened the door and stepped out into the snow before I could protest further. The cold air rushed into the car like an attack, and I watched him walk around to the hood and lift it up. He bent over the engine for a few minutes, doing something I couldn't see, then slammed. The hood shut with more force than necessary. When he came back to my window, his hair was already dusted with snow, and his cheeks were red from the cold. He motioned for me to roll down the window, which I did reluctantly. "The engine's dead," he said, as if this was a surprise to him. "Looks like the alternator finally gave out. I told you this old car was getting unreliable." But the car wasn't old. Michael had bought it for me just 2 years ago, a reliable sedan with all the safety features he thought I needed. It had never given me a moment of trouble, had always started promptly and run smoothly. The coincidence of it breaking down now, in this place, at this moment, was so improbable that it couldn't be a coincidence at all. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said, stepping away from the car. "Keep the doors locked." "Michael, wait." I reached through the window toward him, but he was already backing away. "Please don't do this. Please don't leave me here." "I have to, Mom. I'm sorry, but I have to." And then he turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until the snow swallowed him completely. I sat in the car watching the place where he had disappeared, waiting for him to come back, waiting for him to change his mind, waiting for the son I had raised to remember who he was supposed to be. But he didn't come back. The snow kept falling, heavier now, and the temperature kept dropping. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I tried to start the car, hoping that whatever Michael had done to disable it might have been temporary. But nothing happened when I turned the key. No sound at all, not even the click of a dead battery. I sat there in the growing cold, trying to understand what was happening to me. My son, the boy I had adopted and raised and loved more than my own life, had brought me to this desolate place and abandoned me. He had disabled my transportation and left me stranded in a snowstorm, with temperatures dropping and no shelter, except a car that was quickly becoming as cold as the air outside. This wasn't negligence or poor judgment. This wasn't even cruelty in the heat of anger. This was calculated and deliberate. This was planned. Michael had chosen this place, had chosen this weather, had chosen this method of forcing me into compliance with his wishes. He was using the threat of freezing to death as leverage to make me grateful for the rescue that would take me directly to the place I didn't want to go. The realization was so monstrous that part of me refused to believe it. This was Michael, my Michael, the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who had cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke up with him, who had called me every week during his first year of college because he was homesick. He couldn't be capable of something like this. But the evidence was all around me. The abandoned location that no one would think to search. The disabled car that stranded me in place. The weather that made survival a race against time. The timing that gave him maximum leverage over my choices. Every detail had been planned. Every variable accounted for. I thought about the drive out here, about the way he had seemed so relaxed and cheerful, the way he had asked about my daily life with apparent interest. He had been saying goodbye, I realized. He had been taking one last look at the mother he was about to destroy, making conversation to fill the time until he could get me where he needed me to be. The cold was starting to seep through my coat, and I could see my breath forming small clouds inside the car. I knew enough about hypothermia to understand that I was in real danger. The car would provide some protection from the wind, but without heat, it would only delay the inevitable. I had maybe a few hours before the cold became life-threatening, and that was assuming the temperature didn't drop any further. I thought about Michael walking back toward the main road, probably to a warm car he had hidden somewhere, to a phone call that would bring help at exactly the right moment to make him look like a hero rather than the architect of this nightmare. I thought about how he would explain my condition when help arrived, How he would describe finding his poor, confused mother stranded in the snow, clearly unable to care for herself safely. The narrative was already written. I would be rescued, traumatized and grateful, and taken directly to Sunset Manor for my own protection. Any protests I made would be attributed to the trauma of my experience, to the confusion and disorientation that came with exposure and fear. Who would believe that a successful businessman would deliberately endanger his own mother's life? Who would question the devoted son who had risked his own safety to get help for his elderly parent? But as I sat there in the growing cold, something else began to stir inside me. Something that had been dormant for a long time, buried under years of unconditional love and maternal sacrifice. It was anger, pure and clean and sharp as the wind outside. Not the anger of disappointment or hurt feelings, but the anger of someone who had been betrayed by the person they trusted most in the world. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, grateful for the habits of an old woman who never went anywhere without it. The screen lit up, showing full bars and a battery at 80%. Michael had assumed I would be helpless here, but he had forgotten that his mother wasn't as helpless as she looked. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for the number I needed, the one that would change everything between us. Not the police, not emergency services, not anyone who would simply rescue me and deliver me into Michael's trap. I needed someone who understood power, someone who knew how to use it, someone who could help me fight back against a son who thought his mother was too old and too naive to defend herself. I found the number I was looking for and pressed call, listening to it ring while snow continued to accumulate on the windshield and the temperature continued to drop. When the voice answered, professional and crisp, I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I felt dangerous. Patricia Wellington's office. This is Gloria Bennett. I need to speak with Patricia immediately. Tell her it's about the Bennett accounts. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Mrs. Bennett, Ms. Wellington is in a meeting, but let me see if she's available for you. Please hold. While I waited, I looked out at the railroad tracks, disappearing into the snow, at the abandoned landscape where my son had left me to die or surrender. He thought he knew who I was, thought he understood the limits of my power and influence. He thought I was just another helpless old woman who would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and care he chose to give me. He was about to learn how wrong he was. He was about to discover that his quiet, generous mother had secrets he had never suspected, resources he had never imagined, and a capacity for strategic thinking that came from 40 years of managing money and making investments while he thought she was just writing checks. Gloria? Patricia's voice came through the phone, warm with genuine concern. What's wrong? You sound upset. I need you to freeze everything, Patricia. Every account, every investment, every asset that has Michael's name on it. I need it done now, and I need it done completely. Gloria, what happened? Are you all right? I looked out at the snow falling harder now, at the desolate place where my son had left me to freeze or surrender to his will. I thought about 37 years of love and sacrifice and unconditional support, and about the phone call that would end all of that forever. No, I said, my voice steady despite the cold that was beginning to make my fingers stiff. I'm not all right, but I'm about to be. Patricia Wellington had been my financial advisor for 15 years, ever since I had decided that keeping my money in simple savings accounts wasn't going to provide the kind of security I needed for my future or the kind of resources I wanted to give Michael. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her wealth management firm from nothing, and she understood better than most people that appearances could be deceiving when it came to who held real financial power. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, Patricia said, and I could hear the sound of her fingers already moving across a keyboard. She had handled enough crisis situations to know that when a client called with an emergency, you asked questions later and took action first. Everything that's in Michael's name but funded with my money needs to be frozen immediately. The business accounts, the investment portfolios, the real estate holdings, the lines of credit. All of it. My voice was getting stronger as I spoke, fueled by a clarity that came from finally understanding exactly what kind of game I was playing and what weapons I had available. Gloria, that's going to be complicated. Some of those assets are in his name only, and even though you were the funding source, legally he has control over them. No, he doesn't. I shifted in the car seat, trying to keep warm while snow continued to pile up on the windshield. Remember the structure we set up 5 years ago when I was worried about estate planning? All those gifts and loans weren't actually gifts. They were investments in ventures that I maintained controlling interest in, with agreements that allowed me to call in the debt or reclaim the assets under specific circumstances. There was a pause while Patricia accessed the files, and I could hear her breathing change as she began to understand what I was asking her to do. Gloria, are you sure about this? If you execute these clauses, it's going to destroy him financially. Everything he's built, everything he owns, it all reverts back to you. His businesses, his houses, his investment accounts, even his children's college funds. He'll lose everything. He's trying to have me declared incompetent so he can force me into a nursing home against my will, I said, my words creating small clouds of vapor in the increasingly cold air. He brought me to an abandoned location and left me here in a snowstorm, expecting me to freeze until I'm desperate enough to agree to anything he wants. I'd say that qualifies as an extreme circumstance. Jesus, Gloria, are you safe? Do you need me to call the police? Not yet. First, I need you to execute those agreements. How long will it take? I could hear more typing, faster now, and the sound of Patricia moving around her office. The electronic transfers I can do immediately. The real estate and business assets will take a few hours because I need to file paperwork with the banks and notify the relevant institutions. But Gloria, once I start this process, there's no going back. These agreements were designed to be nuclear options. They'll devastate him completely. Good. The word came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't soften it. He's about to learn that actions have consequences, and that his mother isn't the helpless old woman he thinks she is. All right, I'm starting with the liquid assets now. His primary checking account, his investment portfolio, his business operating accounts. They're all locked as of this moment. I felt a surge of satisfaction that was almost warming in the bitter cold. What about his credit lines? Those too. The credit cards, the business lines of credit, the home equity loans. All frozen. Gloria, his debit cards just became useless pieces of plastic. How long before he notices? Depends on when he tries to use them. If he stops for gas or food, he'll find out pretty quickly. The business accounts will probably trigger alerts to his accountant and his office manager within the hour. I thought about Michael, probably sitting in a warm car somewhere nearby, waiting for what he considered an appropriate amount of time to pass before calling for help. He was likely checking his watch, maybe making calls to arrange the reception at Sunset Manor, possibly even calling Sarah to tell her that I had finally agreed to the move and would be safely installed in my new home by evening. He had no idea that with each minute that passed, his entire financial world was crumbling around him. He had no idea that the mother he had abandoned in the snow was systematically dismantling everything he had built with her money. Patricia, what about the house, the one where he lives with Sarah and the children? That's more complicated. It's in both their names, but the down payment and the mortgage payments have been coming from funds you provided. I can freeze his access to the mortgage account, which means they'll start getting default notices within a month. But I can't immediately force a sale. What if I call in the loan I made for the down payment? That would trigger immediate foreclosure proceedings. The house would have to be sold to pay back the debt, and since the loan was for the full down payment amount plus interest, there might not be anything left for them after the sale. I thought about Sarah, who had always been kind to me, who had never asked for anything, and had often seemed uncomfortable with Michael's extravagant spending. I thought about Emma and Tyler and little Sophie, who would be confused and frightened if their world suddenly fell apart. Hold off on the house. For now, I said. Sarah and the children don't deserve to suffer for what Michael is doing. What about his businesses? He's got 3 companies that are essentially wholly owned by him, but funded entirely through your investments. Those I want shut down immediately. Transfer all the assets back to my accounts and notify his business partners that their agreements are void due to breach of contract. Gloria, this is going to affect other people too. He has employees, business partners, clients who depend on those companies. Then they should have done business with someone who wasn't funding his operations, with money stolen from his mother. My voice was getting colder, and not just from the temperature. Michael made his choices, Patricia. Now he gets to live with the consequences. I could hear Patricia working, the rapid clicking of keys interspersed with phone calls to banks and investment firms. She had done this kind of financial restructuring before, though probably never under quite these circumstances. She understood that when you gave someone the power to destroy their enemies financially, you didn't question their reasons for using it. The business accounts are empty now, she said, after about 20 minutes. I've also frozen his personal investment portfolio and notified his stockbroker that all transactions require your written approval going forward. How are you holding up out there? I looked around the car, noting that my breath was now consistently visible and that I was starting to feel the cold seeping through my clothes despite my heavy coat. The snow had gotten heavier, and I could barely see the railroad tracks anymore, through the accumulation on the windshield. I'm getting colder, but I'll survive long enough to see this through. What's next? I'm working on the real estate now. Besides the house, he's got that rental property downtown and the vacation cabin in the mountains. Both purchased entirely with your money, both technically owned by investment trusts that you control. Sell them both. I want them on the market by tomorrow morning. That's going to be difficult to explain to his tenants and to the property management companies. Tell them the owner has decided to liquidate her real estate portfolio. They don't need to know why. While Patricia continued working through the assets, I found myself thinking about the paperwork that had created this situation. 5 years ago, when I had begun to worry about estate planning and about what would happen to my money when I died, Patricia had suggested a structure that would protect my investments, while still allowing me to support Michael's ventures. Instead of simply giving him money outright, we had created a series of loans and investment agreements that looked like gifts, but were actually carefully structured financial instruments. Every dollar I had given Michael came with strings attached, clauses that allowed me to recall the funds under specific circumstances. It had seemed like an unnecessary precaution at the time, a way to protect against some theoretical future problem that would probably never arise. I had never imagined that the problem would be Michael himself, that the son I was trying to protect would become the threat I needed protection from. But Patricia had insisted on the structure, and I had agreed to it because it seemed harmless, and because it made her feel better about the large amounts of money I was transferring to someone else's control. Now, sitting in a car that was rapidly becoming as cold as a refrigerator, I was grateful for Patricia's paranoia and attention to detail. Every check I had written, every transfer I had authorized, every investment I had funded had been documented and structured to maintain my ultimate control. Michael thought he owned his businesses and his properties and his lifestyle, but legally, it all belonged to me. Gloria, I've got some interesting news, Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. Do you remember that tech startup Michael invested in about 3 years ago? The one where he put in $200,000? Vaguely. He said it was going to revolutionize something or other. Did we lose the money? Actually, no. The company just went public last month, and Michael's stake is now worth about $12 million. But since the original investment came from funds you provided through one of our agreements, the entire windfall belongs to you. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat. though whether it was from amusement or hysteria, I couldn't tell. So, while he's been planning to have me declared incompetent, he's been sitting on an investment that made me $12 million richer. Essentially, yes, and he probably doesn't even know about the valuation yet. The company's stock has been climbing steadily since the IPO, but the official documentation of his holdings won't reach him until the end of the quarter. Transfer it all to my primary investment account. I want him to find out about his windfall at the same time he discovers he can't access it. Already working on it. Gloria, I have to ask, are you planning to give any of this back to him eventually? This is his entire life we're dismantling. I thought about that question while I watched the snow fall harder outside, while I felt the cold beginning to penetrate my bones, while I contemplated the calculation and cruelty it had taken for my son to bring me to this place and leave me here. I thought about 37 years of loving someone who had just proven that he saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his convenience. That depends entirely on Michael, I said finally. If he proves that he's capable of genuine remorse, of understanding what he's done and why it was wrong, then maybe we can discuss rebuilding our relationship. But if he doubles down on this path, if he continues to try to manipulate and control me, then he can live with the consequences of his choices. What about the grandchildren? This is going to affect them too. That was the question that hurt the most, because I loved Emma and Tyler and Sophie with the same fierce intensity I had once felt for their father. They were innocent in all of this, victims of their father's decisions just as much as I was. But I also knew that sometimes protecting the people you love means making decisions that hurt in the short term, but prevent greater damage in the long term. The children's college funds were set up as irrevocable trusts, I said. Michael can't access them, and neither can I. Their education is protected regardless of what happens between Michael and me. As for the rest of it, maybe this will teach them something about the consequences of taking advantage of people who love you. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. Gloria, I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you do anything vindictive or cruel. This isn't like you. You're right, I said, feeling tears start to form in my eyes for the first time since this nightmare had begun. This isn't like me at all. The Gloria you know would have forgiven Michael, would have made excuses for his behavior, would have gone quietly to Sunset Manor rather than cause trouble. But that Gloria was a fool who spent 37 years enabling someone who doesn't love her enough to treat her with basic human decency. I wiped my eyes with my gloved hand, angry at myself for crying when I needed to be strong. That Gloria raised a son who thinks it's acceptable to abandon his elderly mother in a snowstorm to force her compliance with his wishes. So maybe it's time for a different Gloria to take over. One who understands that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just weakness disguised as virtue. All right, Patricia said, and I could hear the determination in her voice. Then let's finish this. I've got the real estate listings prepared, and I'm filing the paperwork to dissolve his business partnerships. His corporate credit cards are canceled, his business bank accounts are closed, and his investment portfolio is back under your exclusive control. By the time I'm done, Michael Bennett will own nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever cash he has in his wallet. How long before everything is complete? Another hour, maybe 2 for the more complex transfers. The real estate will take a few days to hit the market, but the freeze on his access is immediate. I checked the time on my phone and realized that Michael had been gone for almost 2 hours. If he was really walking for help, he should have reached the main road by now and been able to call for assistance. The fact that no one had arrived yet confirmed what I already knew. This delay was deliberate, designed to maximize my discomfort and desperation. Patricia, I need you to do one more thing for me. I want you to call Sunset Manor and cancel the reservation that Michael made for me. Tell them that Mrs. Bennett has decided not to proceed with the admission and that any paperwork signed on my behalf was done without my consent. Consider it done. What should I tell them if they ask for an explanation? Tell them that Mrs. Bennet is not in need of assisted living at this time, and that anyone claiming otherwise is acting without authority. I felt a grim satisfaction at the thought of Michael arriving at the facility later today with a traumatized and grateful mother, only to discover that there was no room waiting for us. Gloria, what's your plan for getting out of there? You can't stay in that car much longer in this weather. She was right. I could feel the cold settling deeper into my body, and I knew that I was approaching the point where my physical safety would become a real concern. But I also knew that rescue now, before Michael's world had completely collapsed, would give him the opportunity to spin this situation to his advantage. I'm going to wait a little longer, I said. I want to make sure that when Michael tries to use his credit cards or access his accounts, he gets the full impact of what's happening. I want him to understand that his financial life is over before anyone comes to help me. That's dangerous, Gloria. Hypothermia can set in faster than you think, especially at your age. I'll be careful, but I need Michael to fully comprehend what he's lost before I allow myself to be rescued. Otherwise, he'll just see this as a temporary setback, something he can fix with charm and manipulation once I'm safely installed wherever he wants me. All right, but I'm going to keep working as fast as I can. The sooner we get this done, the sooner you can get somewhere warm. While Patricia continued, dismantling Michael's financial empire, I sat in the car and thought about what would happen next. Michael would eventually discover that his cards weren't working, that his accounts were frozen, that his businesses had been shut down. He would probably try to call me, assuming that there had been some mistake, some computer error that could be easily resolved. When he realized that the freeze was deliberate, he would be forced to confront the fact that his mother wasn't the helpless victim he had believed her to be. He would have to grapple with the reality that the woman he had abandoned in the snow had the power to destroy his life with a single phone call, and that she had chosen to use that power. I wondered if he would understand why I had done it, if he would be capable of seeing past his own anger and inconvenience to recognize the betrayal that had prompted my response. I wondered if he would feel even a moment of shame about what he had put me through, or if he would simply be furious that his plan had backfired. Most of all, I wondered if there was any part of the son I had raised still left inside the man who had driven me out here today. I wondered if the boy who had once held my hand during thunderstorms still existed somewhere beneath the cold calculation of the person who could abandon his mother to freeze in the wilderness. Gloria, it's done, Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of finality that felt like the closing of a door. Every asset that was purchased with your money or funded through your investments has been frozen or reclaimed. Michael Bennet just went from being a millionaire to being essentially penniless, and he doesn't even know it yet. Thank you, Patricia. I know this wasn't easy to do. It was the right thing to do, Gloria. No one should be treated the way he's treating you, especially not by their own child. I just hope he's smart enough to understand what this means and what he needs to do to fix it. So do I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. I need to hang up now and call for help. I've been out here long enough to make my point, and I'm starting to worry about frostbite. Call me as soon as you're somewhere safe, Patricia said, and Gloria, I'm proud of you. It took courage to do what you just did. After I hung up, I sat in the car for a few more minutes, gathering my thoughts and preparing for what would come next. In a few hours, Michael's carefully constructed world would begin to crumble around him. His credit cards would be declined. His business partners would receive notifications that their agreements had been terminated. His employees would be told that their companies were being dissolved. He would finally understand that his mother wasn't the fragile, dependent woman he had taken her for. He would learn that Gloria Bennet wasn't just someone who wrote checks when asked. She was someone who had built a financial empire quietly and strategically, someone who had been playing a much more sophisticated game than he had ever realized. But first, I needed to survive long enough to see his reaction. I needed to get warm and safe so that I could witness the education I was about to give my son about the consequences of betraying the people who love you most. I pulled out my phone one more time and dialed 911, ready to begin the final act of this particular drama. Ready to be rescued, not as the victim Michael had expected me to be, but as the architect of his destruction. Ready to see what kind of man my son really was when everything he thought he owned was taken away from him. The rescue came 47 minutes after I called 911, in the form of 2 paramedics and a sheriff's deputy who looked like they couldn't quite believe they were being asked to retrieve an elderly woman from abandoned railroad tracks in the middle of a blizzard. They found me semi-conscious in the front seat of Michael's car, my lips blue and my hands so stiff I could barely grip my phone. The lead paramedic, a woman named Janet, who looked to be about my age, wrapped me in heated blankets while asking questions about how long I had been there and whether I had any medical conditions they should know about. I told them about my blood pressure medication and my arthritis, but I didn't mention the phone calls I had made while waiting for rescue. That information wasn't relevant to my immediate medical needs, and it certainly wasn't something I wanted, spread around the local emergency services. They loaded me into the ambulance with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience with winter emergencies, though I could see in their faces that they were puzzled by the circumstances. An elderly woman alone in a car on abandoned tracks was unusual enough, but the fact that the car appeared to have been deliberately disabled made the situation even more mysterious. During the ride to the hospital, Janet kept asking about my son, about where he was and whether anyone had been able to reach him to let him know I was safe. I told her that Michael had gone for help when the car broke down, that he was probably worried sick and looking for me. The lie came easily, though it left a bitter taste in my mouth. What I didn't tell her was that Michael's phone had been ringing constantly for the last 20 minutes, according to the notification sounds I could hear even over the ambulance siren. He was somewhere warm and safe, probably checking his watch and deciding that enough time had passed to make his rescue look believable. He had no idea that while he had been waiting for me to become desperate enough to accept his terms, I had been systematically destroying everything he thought he owned. At the hospital, they treated me for mild hypothermia and dehydration, hooking me up to warm IV fluids and monitoring my heart rate while my body temperature slowly returned to normal. The doctor, a young man who reminded me painfully of Michael at that age, said I was lucky that I hadn't been out there much longer. Another hour or two, and we might have been dealing with frostbite or worse. I was lying in the hospital bed, finally warm for the first time in hours, when my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Michael's name, and I stared at it for a long moment before deciding to answer. This would be interesting. Mom? Oh, thank God, I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you all right? I got back to the car and you were gone, and there was no sign of where you had gone. I've been searching everywhere for you. His voice was perfect, full of panic and relief and exactly the right amount of guilt. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't seen him walk away from me deliberately, I might have believed that he was genuinely worried about my welfare. I'm in the hospital, Michael. I had to call for help when you didn't come back. The hospital? What happened? Are you hurt? Hypothermia. Apparently, sitting in a cold car for hours in a snowstorm isn't good for people my age. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, I could hear him calculating how much concern to show without admitting any responsibility for my condition. I'm so sorry, Mom. I tried to get back as quickly as I could, but the storm was worse than I expected, and it took forever to find someone with a working phone. I was terrified that something had happened to you. Something did happen to me, Michael. I nearly died. But you're okay now, right? The doctors are taking good care of you? I'm on my way to the hospital right now. We'll get through this together and then we can finally get you settled somewhere safe. The audacity of it took my breath away. Even now, even after leaving me to freeze in a blizzard, he was still pushing his agenda about Sunset Manor. He was treating my near-death experience as nothing more than a convenient crisis that proved his point about my need for professional care. Actually, Michael, I don't think Sunset Manor is going to work out after all. What do you mean? I mean, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to be moving into assisted living. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, as I've proven by surviving your little test today. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. You've been through a trauma, and you're probably still dealing with the effects of the hypothermia. This isn't the time to make major decisions about your future. There it was again, the suggestion that I wasn't competent to make my own choices, that my resistance to his plans was evidence of diminished capacity rather than reasonable self-determination. But this time, I was ready for it. My thinking is perfectly clear, Michael. Clear enough to have made some important decisions while I was sitting in that car waiting for you to come back. What kind of decisions? I could hear something change in his voice, a note of wariness that suggested he was beginning to sense that this conversation wasn't going the way he had expected. Good. It was time for him to start worrying. Financial decisions, primarily. I've been thinking about how I want to manage my money going forward, about what kinds of investments make sense for someone my age. Okay, he said slowly. What does that have to do with anything? Well, I've decided that I've been too generous with my financial support over the years, too willing to fund ventures and lifestyle choices without requiring proper accountability or oversight. So, I've made some changes. What kind of changes? Now I could hear the alarm bells going off in his head, though he was trying to keep his voice casual. He was probably thinking about the business meeting he had scheduled for tomorrow morning, about the investors who were expecting him to sign papers that would require access to his operating accounts. I've restructured my investment portfolio to be more conservative, pulled back from some of the riskier ventures I've been supporting. You know how it is when you get older. You start to worry more about security and less about growth potential. Mom, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that I've asked my financial advisor to review all of my investments and loans to make sure they're properly documented and protected. You'd be surprised how many of the things I thought were gifts were actually structured as loans or equity investments. Patricia found all kinds of paperwork I had forgotten about. The silence that followed was so complete I thought for a moment that the call had been dropped. Then I heard Michael's breathing, quick and shallow, and I knew that he was beginning to understand what I was telling him. You can't do that, he said finally, and all pretense of concern for my welfare had vanished from his voice. Those were gifts. You gave me that money freely, without any expectation of repayment. Did I? Because according to the legal documents, they were investments in your ventures with the understanding that I retained controlling interest. Funny how memory can be unreliable, isn't it? You're confused, Mom. You're not remembering things correctly. The hypothermia has affected your thinking. Has it? Then I suppose you won't mind if I have Patricia explain the situation to you directly. I'm sure she can clear up any confusion about the legal status of those transactions. I could hear him moving now, probably pacing around whatever warm, comfortable place he had been waiting for the appropriate amount of time to pass before calling to check on his abandoned mother. I could hear the panic building in his voice as he realized that something had gone very wrong with his carefully planned scenario. Mom, you need to call Patricia right now and tell her to stop whatever she's doing. This is just a misunderstanding, and we can work it out once you're feeling better. But you can't let her freeze my accounts based on some paperwork you don't remember signing. I remember signing it perfectly well, Michael. I remember Patricia explaining to me that these structures would protect my investments while still allowing me to support your ventures. I remember thinking it was unnecessary at the time, but agreeing to it because it made her feel better about the large amounts of money I was transferring. This is insane. You can't destroy my life because you're angry about what happened today. Angry? I let the word hang in the air for a moment, tasting its inadequacy. Michael, angry doesn't begin to describe what I'm feeling. Angry is what you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic or forgets your birthday. What I'm feeling is something much deeper and much more dangerous. You're not thinking rationally. The stress of today, the medical trauma, it's affecting your judgment. You need to calm down and think about what you're doing. I am thinking, Michael. I'm thinking about a son who would drive his mother to an abandoned location in a snowstorm and leave her there to freeze. I'm thinking about a man who would disable his own car to strand his elderly parent in life-threatening conditions. I'm thinking about someone who would use the threat of death as leverage to force compliance with his wishes. That's not what happened. The car broke down and I went for help. You're creating a conspiracy where none exists. Am I? Then explain to me how a car that's never given me a moment of trouble suddenly developed engine problems at exactly the moment you needed. An excuse to leave me stranded. Explain to me why you chose this particular location for our lunch date, miles from anywhere with no cell phone service and no chance of help passing by. You're paranoid, Mom. You're seeing malice where there was just bad luck and poor timing. Poor timing? I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with my recent brush with hypothermia. Michael, do you think I'm stupid? Do you think that 74 years of life have taught me nothing about reading people and understanding motives? I think you're upset and looking for someone to blame for a scary experience. But blaming me isn't going to help anyone, and destroying my financial life certainly isn't going to solve whatever problems you think we have. The casual dismissal of my perceptions, the suggestion that my understanding of what had happened was nothing more than confused rambling from a traumatized old woman, crystallized everything I had been feeling into something sharp and focused. Let me ask you something, Michael. When you drove me out to those railroad tracks today, what did you think was going to happen? What was your plan for how this day was going to end? I thought we were going to have lunch and then visit Sunset Manor, just like I told you. And when the car conveniently broke down in the middle of nowhere, what did you think was going to happen then? I thought I would get help, and we would be rescued and taken to safety. Where? Taken to safety where? There was another pause, and I could hear him realizing that he had walked into a trap of his own making. If he admitted that the plan was to take me directly to Sunset Manor after the rescue, he would be confirming that the breakdown was part of a larger scheme to force my compliance. If he claimed that we would have gone home, he would be contradicting everything he had said about the urgency of getting me into care. We would have gone wherever was necessary to make sure you were safe and warm. And if I had refused to go to Sunset Manor after being rescued? If I had insisted on going home to my own house? Mom, I don't see the point of these hypothetical questions. What matters is that you're safe now, and we can move forward with making sure something like this doesn't happen again. By putting me somewhere you can control me. By putting you somewhere you'll be safe and well cared for. I closed my eyes and tried to remember when my son had become someone who could speak to me with such casual condescension, such complete disregard for my autonomy and intelligence. When had the boy who used to ask my advice about everything become a man who dismissed my concerns as the confused ramblings of an incompetent old woman? Michael, do you love me? The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, I heard the uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure what answer was expected or safe. Of course I love you, Mom. You're my mother. Why would you even ask that? Because I'm trying to understand how someone who loves me could do what you did today. I'm trying to understand how love and betrayal can exist in the same heart. How someone can claim to care about my welfare while actively endangering my life. I would never endanger your life. Everything I've done has been to protect you. Protect me from what? From yourself. From making decisions that aren't in your best interest. From the isolation and vulnerability that come with living alone at your age. So you decided to isolate me in the middle of nowhere and make me vulnerable to freezing to death. That's not what I decided. That's what happened because of circumstances beyond my control. I realized then that he genuinely believed what he was saying, or at least had convinced himself to believe it. In his mind, he had created a narrative where everything he had done was reasonable and necessary, where my resistance was evidence of incompetence, where my survival was proof of his good intentions rather than my own resourcefulness. He couldn't see the contradiction between claiming to love me and treating me like an obstacle to be managed. He couldn't understand that respect and care weren't the same thing as control and manipulation. He had constructed a version of reality where he was the responsible son trying to help his difficult mother, and nothing I said would penetrate that self-serving delusion. Michael, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to... Sunset Manor. I am not going to submit to being declared incompetent. I am not going to allow you to make decisions about my life based on your convenience rather than my needs. Mom, you're not being realistic about your situation. I'm being perfectly realistic. I'm a 74-year-old woman who lives independently, manages her own finances, and makes her own decisions. The fact that you disagree with some of those decisions doesn't make me incompetent. It makes you stubborn and potentially dangerous to yourself. And what does it make you, Michael? What do you call someone who would abandon his mother in a blizzard to force her compliance with his wishes? I call him someone who's trying to do the right thing in a difficult situation. That was the moment when I understood that there was no reasoning with him, no appeal to conscience or memory or love that would penetrate the wall of justification he had built around his actions. He had decided that he knew what was best for me, and any resistance to his plans was simply evidence that I needed more control, not less. Then we have nothing more to discuss, I said. You should probably check your accounts and credit cards, though. You might find some surprises waiting for you. What did you do? I protected my investments from someone who was using them irresponsibly. You can't do this to me. I already have. Every dollar you thought you owned, every asset you thought was yours, every business you thought you controlled, it all belongs to me, Michael. It always has. You just never bothered to read the fine print. This is extortion. This is consequence. This is what happens when you mistake generosity for weakness, when you confuse love with stupidity, when you decide that your mother is nothing more than an ATM with inconvenient opinions. I could hear him breathing hard now, could hear the sound of papers rustling as he probably scrambled to find documents that would prove me wrong. But there were no such documents, because Patricia had been very careful to structure everything properly from the beginning. Mom, please. You can't destroy everything I've built over one bad day. You can't ruin my life because you're angry about what happened. I'm not ruining your life, Michael. I'm taking back mine. For 37 years, I've given you everything you asked for without question or condition. I've funded your dreams and your lifestyle and your businesses without ever demanding accountability or respect in return. I've been a mother who loved unconditionally, and you've been a son who took that love for granted. I never took anything for granted. Didn't you? When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my life without needing something from me? When was the last time you treated me like a person whose opinions and feelings mattered, rather than an obstacle to your plans? The silence stretched on so long that I began to think he had hung up. Then I heard him clear his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, less certain. I don't know. Neither do I, Michael. And that's the problem. Somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as your means to an end. You stopped loving me and started using me. And today, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. So what happens now? Now you learn to live without my money. You learn to build a life based on your own efforts rather than my generosity. You learn what it feels like to be abandoned by someone you thought you could depend on. And if I can't? If losing everything destroys my marriage and my family and my career? Then you'll understand how it feels to have your life destroyed by someone who claims to love you. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not from cold this time, but from the magnitude of what I had just done. I had spent 37 years building a relationship with my son, and I had just destroyed it in a single conversation. I had given him everything he thought he wanted, and then I had taken it all away. But as I lay in that hospital bed, warm and safe and finally free from the illusion that love could conquer all, I didn't feel regret. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world, who had finally stopped making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort. Michael would learn, probably sooner than he expected, that his credit cards had been canceled and his bank accounts frozen. He would discover that his business partners had been notified that their agreements were void, that his employees had been told their companies were being dissolved, that his investment portfolio was no longer accessible to him. He would realize that the comfortable life he had built was constructed entirely on a foundation that belonged to someone else, and that the someone else had just decided to reclaim her property. He would understand, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, what it meant to be truly vulnerable and dependent. And maybe, if I was very lucky, he would also understand what it meant to be sorry. The hospital discharged me the following morning with instructions to take it easy for a few days and follow up with my primary care physician. I felt stronger than I had in months, despite the ordeal of the previous day. There was something clarifying about surviving both hypothermia and the complete destruction of my relationship with my son. It was as if I had been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there, and now that it was gone, I could breathe freely for the first time in years. Patricia picked me up from the hospital, having driven down from the city as soon as she heard about my rescue. She looked worried and angry in equal measure, her usually perfect composure showing cracks that revealed just how much my situation had affected her. "Gloria, I've been in this business for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what we did yesterday," she said as we drove through the snow-covered streets toward my house. The scope of the financial restructuring, the speed with which we had to execute it, the legal complexity of unwinding all those agreements. It was like performing surgery with a chainsaw. But it worked. Oh, it worked. Michael Bennett went from being worth approximately $8 million to owing approximately $2 million in the span of 6 hours. When he tries to access any of his accounts today, he's going to discover that he doesn't own anything anymore. I felt a satisfaction that was almost guilty in its intensity. What about his house, Sarah, and the children? I held off on foreclosure proceedings like you asked, but I did freeze his access to the mortgage account. They'll start getting default notices within 30 days if the situation isn't resolved. We pulled into my driveway, and I was surprised by how normal everything looked. My house sat exactly where I had left it yesterday morning, surrounded by the same trees and the same neighbors, as if the world hadn't fundamentally changed while I was fighting for my life on those railroad tracks. "Patricia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me that you'll keep it confidential until I decide how to handle it." She turned off the engine and looked at me with the serious expression she reserved for her most important clients. "Of course. What is it?" "Michael isn't my biological son." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I assumed as much from some of the comments you made yesterday. Adoption?" "Yes, but it's more complicated than that. Michael doesn't just have different biological parents. He has a different name, a different history, a different identity than what he's been living with for the past 37 years. Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing this information and probably calculating its implications. "Gloria, are you telling me that Michael doesn't know he's adopted?" "He knows he's adopted. What he doesn't know is who he really is, where he really came from, and why he ended up in the foster system in the first place." I had never told this story to anyone except Robert, and even then, only in pieces over many years. It felt strange. To speak it aloud now, to give voice to secrets I had carried for nearly 4 decades. When Michael was placed in our home, he came with very little information about his background. The social workers said his parents had lost custody due to neglect and substance abuse, that they had disappeared and couldn't be located for the termination proceedings. They said his birth name was Michael Anthony Sullivan, and that he had been in foster care for 2 years before coming to us. But that wasn't true. It was partially true. He had been in foster care for 2 years, and his parents had lost custody. But his birth name wasn't Michael Anthony Sullivan. It was David Bennett Caldwell. Patricia's eyes widened as she processed the significance of that name. Bennett, he already had your surname? He had my maiden name. Gloria Bennett became Gloria Morgan when I married Robert, but I was born Gloria Bennett, and David Bennett Caldwell was my nephew. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the snow melting off the car's windshield. Patricia stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, one that mixed professional shock with personal amazement. "Your nephew," she repeated slowly. "Michael is your biological nephew and he doesn't know it." His father was my younger brother, Danny. Danny Bennett was a charming, irresponsible man who could talk his way into anything and out of everything. He was also an alcoholic and a drug addict who couldn't hold a job or maintain a relationship for longer than a few months. I looked out at my house, at the life I had built in this quiet neighborhood, and tried to reconcile it with the chaos that had characterized my family of origin. Danny got a girl pregnant when he was 22. Her name was Linda Caldwell, and she was just as messed up as he was. They got married in a courthouse ceremony that my parents refused to attend, and they moved to a different state where no one knew them. And that's where Michael was born? David was born, yes. For the first 4 years of his life, he lived with parents who were more interested in their next high than in taking care of their child. The house was condemned twice. Child services was called multiple times. There were reports of him being left alone for days while Danny and Linda went on benders. Patricia leaned back in her seat, clearly struggling to process the implications of what I was telling her. "How did you find out about this?" "I hired a private investigator after the adoption was finalized. I wanted to know more about Michael's background, partly for medical reasons and partly because I felt like I needed to understand what he had been through before he came to us." The investigator discovered that the official records had been altered to protect the privacy of the birth family. Altered how? Names were changed, locations were obscured, family connections were severed. The Social Services Department had a policy of trying to prevent adopted children from tracking down birth families who had abused or abandoned them. They thought it was kinder to give the children completely fresh starts with no ties to their traumatic pasts. I remembered the day the investigator had called with his findings, the way my hands had shaken as I read the report that connected the little boy I was raising to the family I had tried so hard to escape. When I learned that Michael was Danny's son, I was devastated, not because I didn't want him, but because I realized that all the problems I had tried to leave behind by moving away from my family had followed me home anyway. "Did you ever consider telling him the truth?" "Every day for 37 years. But how do you tell a child that you're not just his adoptive mother, but his aunt? How do you explain that his father was your brother, a man who abandoned him to pursue drugs and alcohol? How do you help him understand that the family who was supposed to protect him chose addiction over responsibility?" Patricia was quiet for a long time, staring out the windshield at the snow-covered yard. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and careful. "Gloria, this changes everything about what happened yesterday, doesn't it? This isn't just about an ungrateful adopted son betraying his generous mother. This is about family betrayal on a much deeper level." "Yes, it is. Michael doesn't just carry Danny's genes. He carries Danny's capacity for selfishness and manipulation. Yesterday, when he left me on those railroad tracks, he was acting exactly like his biological father would have acted. He was choosing his own convenience over the welfare of someone who loved him. But he doesn't know that. He doesn't know he's repeating patterns that destroyed his original family. I thought about that for a moment. About the weight of genetic predisposition versus the power of choice. About whether Michael's actions were inevitable or simply tragic. Maybe he doesn't need to know his history to understand that what he did was wrong. Maybe the fact that he's capable of abandoning someone who loves him says everything about who he is, regardless of whose son he is. Or maybe, Patricia said gently, he needs to know the truth about where he came from so he can understand where he's heading. Maybe knowing about Danny will help him see what he's in danger of becoming. We sat in the car for another few minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of the secrets I had just revealed. Finally, Patricia asked the question I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. What are you going to do now? I looked at my house again, at the place where I had raised Michael and loved him, and believed that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. I thought about the boy who had needed so much healing when he first came to us, and about the man who had left me to freeze in the wilderness because my existence had become inconvenient to him. I'm going to give him a choice, I said finally. I'm going to tell him the truth about who he is and where he came from, and then I'm going to let him decide what kind of person he wants to be going forward. And if he chooses to continue down the path he's on, if knowing the truth doesn't change anything, then I'll know that I tried everything possible to save him from becoming his father, and I'll be able to live with whatever happens next. Patricia helped me carry my things into the house, and we spent the next hour going over the financial details of what had happened the day before. The scope of Michael's losses was even more comprehensive than I had realized. 3 businesses shuttered, 12 employees laid off, investment partnerships dissolved, real estate holdings put up for immediate sale. His entire professional identity had been erased in a matter of hours. Has he tried to contact you since last night? Patricia asked as she prepared to leave. 17 missed calls and 23 text messages, according to my phone. I haven't read them yet. Are you going to? Eventually. But first, I need to decide exactly what I want to say to him when we finally talk. After Patricia left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and my phone, staring at the accumulation of desperate messages from my son. I could see from the preview text that they ranged from anger to pleading to threats to promises of change. The progression was probably predictable. Denial, bargaining, rage, and maybe, if I was lucky, some form of acceptance. But I wasn't ready to read them yet. Instead, I called my lawyer, a man named Harold Pemberton, who had handled my legal affairs for more than a decade. Harold was old enough to remember when lawyers actually got to know their clients, and patient, enough to listen to complicated family situations without immediately suggesting litigation. Gloria, Patricia Wellington called me this morning about some urgent financial restructuring you needed done. She said it was a family emergency, but she couldn't give me details due to confidentiality concerns. It was an emergency, Harold, but it's resolved now. What I need from you is more complicated, and it's going to require absolute discretion. Of course. What can I do for you? I told Harold about Michael's abandonment, about the financial consequences I had imposed, and about the family history that Michael didn't know. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never expressing surprise or judgment about what I was revealing. Gloria, if you're planning to tell Michael about his biological parentage, you need to be prepared for the legal implications. There could be inheritance issues, medical history concerns, and potentially even criminal considerations if his father is still alive, and there are outstanding warrants or debts. I've thought about that. I want you to conduct a comprehensive search for Danny Bennett and Linda Caldwell. I want to know if they're alive, where they are, what their current situations look like, and whether there are any legal issues Michael might inherit by association. That could take some time, depending on how much they've moved around and whether they've changed their names. I have time. I also want you to prepare documentation that proves Michael's true identity, including the original birth certificate and the adoption records that were sealed when he became our son. If I'm going to tell him the truth, I want to be able to prove it. Are you sure about this, Gloria? Once you open this door, you can't close it again. Michael's entire understanding of himself and his history will change fundamentally. I thought about the man who had looked me in the eye and told me I was becoming a burden, who had driven me to an abandoned location and left me there to freeze, who had justified his actions by claiming they were for my own good. I thought about the choice between protecting him from a painful truth and giving him the information he needed to understand himself completely. I'm sure, Harold, Michael needs to know who he really is, even if it's painful. Especially if it's painful. All right, I'll start the searches immediately and have a report for you within a week. What about the financial situation? Do you want me to review the agreements Patricia executed to make sure everything was done properly? Yes, but I also want you to prepare a path back for Michael if he demonstrates genuine change. I don't want to destroy him permanently. I want to give him the opportunity to rebuild his life on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. What would that look like? I'm not sure yet. Maybe a gradual restoration of some assets if he meets certain conditions. Maybe the opportunity to earn back my trust through consistent behavioral changes over time. Maybe just the chance to have a relationship with his children, even if he and I can never repair what's been broken between us. Harold was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen many families destroy themselves over money and pride. Gloria, I want you to think very carefully about what you're offering here. If you give Michael a way back, you need to be absolutely certain about what standards you're going to hold him to and what you'll do if he fails to meet them. What do you mean? I mean that if you restore his assets and he betrays you again, you might not get another chance to protect yourself. The element of surprise that allowed you to freeze his account so effectively won't be available a second time. He'll be prepared for your response, and he'll structure his affairs to prevent you from having that kind of leverage again. The truth of that observation hit me like a physical blow. If I gave Michael the chance to rebuild and he used that chance to better protect himself from my influence rather than to become a better person, I would be placing myself at his mercy in a way that could be even more dangerous than what had already happened. Then I'll have to be very careful about what conditions I set and how I verify that he's meeting them. Yes, you will. And Gloria, you'll need to be prepared for the possibility that he won't meet them, that knowing the truth about his parentage won't change his fundamental character. You'll need to be ready to walk away from your son permanently if that's what it takes to protect yourself. After I hung up with Harold, I finally opened my phone and began reading Michael's messages. The progression was exactly what I had expected, starting with confusion and escalating through anger to desperation. The first few messages were variations on, "There must be some mistake," and "Please call Patricia and fix this." Then came accusations that I was being manipulated by unscrupulous financial advisors who were taking advantage of my age and confusion. After that, anger and threats about legal action and claims that I was violating his rights by freezing assets that belonged to him. The most recent messages were different, though. They showed a Michael I hadn't heard from in years, one who sounded genuinely frightened and uncertain rather than arrogant and controlling. "Mom, please call me back. I know you're angry and maybe you have a right to be, but we can work this out. I love you, and I know you love me. And we can find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything we've built together." I talked to Sarah about what happened yesterday, and she's horrified. She says she had no idea I was planning to take you to Sunset Manor against your will, and she's furious with me for not discussing it with her first. She says if I don't fix this situation with you, she's going to take the kids and stay with her mother until I do. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how I never called just to talk anymore, about how I've been treating you like an ATM instead of a person. You're right. I have been taking you for granted, and I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but it's a start. I don't understand how all those financial agreements work, but I'm starting to realize that you've been a lot smarter about money than I ever gave you credit for. I always thought you were just being generous when you helped me with my businesses, but you were actually being strategic, weren't you? You were protecting yourself while still supporting me, and I was too arrogant to see it. Please don't. Give up on me, Mom. I know I screwed up badly, worse than I've ever screwed up anything in my life. But I'm your son, and that has to count for something. That has to be worth fighting for, even when I don't deserve it. The last message had been sent just an hour ago, and it was longer than all the others combined. Mom, I've been awake all night thinking about what you said, about how I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a means to an end. I think you're right. I think somewhere along the way, I forgot that you're not just my mother. You're Gloria Bennett, a woman who lived a whole life before I was born and who deserves respect and autonomy regardless of her relationship to me. I think I started believing that being your son gave me the right to make decisions for you, when it actually gave me the responsibility to honor your decisions even when I disagreed with them. I don't know if you can forgive me for what I did yesterday, and I don't know if I can forgive myself. But I want to try to be the son you deserve, if you'll give me the chance. I want to learn how to love you without trying to control you, how to help you without diminishing you, how to be grateful for what you've given me without taking it for granted. I don't know if it's too late for that, but I hope it's not. I hope we can find a way back to each other that doesn't require either of us to become someone we're not. I read that message 3 times before setting my phone down on the kitchen table. This was the voice of the son I remembered, the one who had been capable of insight and growth and genuine remorse. This was the Michael who had existed before. Success and entitlement had hardened him into someone who could justify abandoning his mother in a blizzard. But I also knew that words were easy when someone was desperate, that promises made in crisis weren't always kept when the crisis passed. Michael had shown me who he was capable of becoming when he thought he had power over me. Now I needed to see who he was capable of becoming when he understood that he didn't. I picked up my phone and dialed his number, ready to begin the conversation. That would determine whether there was anything left to salvage from 37 years of loving someone who had forgotten how to love me back. Mom? His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't slept, and I could hear something in it that I hadn't heard in years. Vulnerability. Hello, Michael. Thank you for calling me back. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. But I read your messages, and I think we need to talk. I want to see you in person. Can I come over? Can we sit down and figure out how to fix this? Not yet. First, we're going to have a conversation over the phone, and you're going to listen to everything I have to say without interrupting. Then, if you still want to see me after you've heard what I have to tell you, we can arrange a meeting. Okay, I'm listening. I took a deep breath and began with the hardest truth of all. Michael, there are things about your past that you don't know. Things I've kept from you because I thought it would be kinder to let you believe a different story about where you came from. What kind of things? Things about your biological parents. Things about why you ended up in foster care. Things about your real name and your real family. The silence that followed was so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then, I heard him breathing, quick and shallow, and I knew he was beginning to understand that whatever I was about to tell him would change everything he thought he knew about himself. Are you ready to hear this, Michael? Because once I tell you, there's no going back to the story you've been living with. I'm ready. Your birth name wasn't Michael Anthony Sullivan. It was David Bennett Caldwell. Your biological father was my younger brother, Danny Bennett. You're not just my adopted son, Michael. You're my nephew. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The noise someone makes when they've been punched in the chest and are trying to remember how to breathe. I waited for him to find his voice, to ask the questions I knew were coming. "Your brother," he said finally. "My father was your brother." "Yes." "And you've known this for 37 years. I found out after the adoption was finalized. I hired an investigator because I wanted to know more about your medical history, and he discovered that the official records had been altered to protect your privacy. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Danny Bennett was a drug addict and an alcoholic who chose his addictions over his responsibilities as a father. Because he and your biological mother abandoned you to pursue drugs and disappeared from your life completely. Because I thought it would be kinder to let you grow up believing that your biological parents were strangers rather than family members who had failed you so completely. Are they still alive?" "I don't know. I'm having them located now, so that you can have all the information you need to make decisions about your future." Michael was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Smaller, more uncertain than I had heard it since he was a child. "Is that why you adopted me? Because I was family?" "Partly, but mostly because you were a little boy who needed someone to love him unconditionally, and I was a woman who needed someone to love. The fact that you were Danny's son made the decision more complicated, not easier." "More complicated how?" "Because I had spent my entire adult life trying to escape the dysfunction and chaos that characterized my family of origin. Because I had watched Danny destroy every relationship and opportunity he was given, and I was terrified that you might have inherited his capacity for selfishness and self-destruction. And yesterday, when I left you on those railroad tracks, you saw Danny in me." The insight was so sharp and accurate that it took my breath away. "Yes. Yesterday you showed me that you were capable of the same kind of cruelty and abandonment that destroyed your biological father's life. And that's why you took everything away from me. Not just to punish me, but to save me from becoming him. I took everything away from you because you proved that having everything hadn't made you a better person. Because wealth and success and security hadn't taught you to value the people who loved you. Because I realized that I had been enabling your worst impulses by making your life so comfortable that you never had to consider the consequences of your actions. So what happens now?" I looked out my kitchen window at the snow-covered yard, at the world that looked the same, but felt completely different than it had 2 days ago. I thought about the choice I was offering him, the chance to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth and accountability rather than entitlement and manipulation. Now you decide who you want to be, Michael. You can choose to learn from this experience, to understand what led you to abandon your mother in a blizzard and commit to never becoming that person again. Or you can choose to be angry and resentful about losing assets that were never really yours to begin with. And if I choose to learn, if I choose to be better, then we'll see if that choice is genuine or just another form of manipulation designed to get your comfortable life back. We'll see if you can sustain behavioral changes when they're difficult and uncomfortable, or if you'll revert to your old patterns as soon as you think I'm not watching. What would I have to do to prove that the change is real? I don't know yet. That's something we'll have to figure out together, if you're willing to do the work. But Michael, you need to understand that this isn't about earning back your money or your businesses or your old life. This is about earning back your soul, about becoming someone worthy of the love you've been given. And if I can't, if I try and fail, then you'll have learned something important about yourself, and you'll have to decide whether that knowledge is enough to build a different kind of life on. Michael was quiet for another long moment, and when he spoke again, I could hear tears in his voice. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to you yesterday, and I'm sorry for all the ways I've taken you for granted over the years. I'm sorry for becoming someone who could justify abandoning his mother in a snowstorm, and I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused you. I know you are, Michael. The question is whether you're sorry enough to do the hard work of changing, or just sorry enough to want the consequences to go away. I want to do the work. I want to be someone you can be proud of again. Then we'll take it one day at a time, and we'll see what kind of man my nephew chooses to become." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation we had just had and about the long road that stretched ahead of us. Michael would have to learn how to live without the financial safety net I had provided for most of his adult life. He would have to discover what kind of person he was when he couldn't rely on my money to solve his problems or smooth over his mistakes. More importantly, he would have to grapple with the knowledge that his capacity for abandonment and betrayal wasn't an aberration. It was a family legacy that had destroyed his biological father's life and threatened to destroy his own. He would have to choose, every single day, to be different than the man who had given him life but not love, responsibility but not respect. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done, and I wasn't sure he was capable of it. But for the first time in years, I was willing to find out. For the first time since he had become an adult, I was willing to give him the chance to earn my respect rather than simply assume he deserved it. 3 months later, Michael sat across from me at my kitchen table, looking thinner and more tired than I had ever seen him, but also somehow more real, more present than he had been in years. He had spent the time working construction jobs and living in a small apartment that he paid for with his own earnings rather than my generosity. Sarah had taken the children to her mother's house, not out of anger, but out of a desire to give Michael the space he needed to figure out who he wanted to be. "I found them," he said, placing a folder on the table between us. "Danny and Linda. Harold's investigator tracked them down." I looked at the folder, but didn't open it. "Do you want to tell me what you found?" "Danny died 3 years ago. Overdose. He never got clean, never held a steady job, never tried to find me or make amends for abandoning me. He died alone in a motel room in Nevada with nothing but a suitcase full of dirty clothes and a wallet with $17 in it." "I'm sorry, Michael." "I'm not. I'm sad, maybe, but not sorry. He made his choices, and they led him exactly where choices like that always lead. I'm grateful that you saved me from that life, even if it took me 37 years to understand." "What you had saved me from?" "And Linda?" "She's alive, but she's in prison for fraud and drug possession. 3rd strike, so she's looking at a long sentence. She says she remembers having a son but doesn't remember what happened to him. The drugs took most of her memory along with everything else." I thought about the young woman Danny had married, about the chaos and addiction that had stolen her child and ultimately her freedom. "Are you going to try to see her?" "I don't think so. She's not really my mother. She's just the woman who gave birth to me. You're my mother, for better or worse, and you're the only one who matters." Michael reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers rough from months of manual labor but gentle in a way I remembered from when he was young. "I want to thank you for telling me the truth, even when it was painful. I needed to know where I came from so I could understand where I was heading. And where is that? Somewhere different than where I was 3 months ago. I'm learning how to work for what I have instead of expecting it to be given to me. I'm learning how to appreciate the people who love me instead of taking them for granted. I'm learning how to be a man instead of a spoiled child with a man's responsibilities. It's hard work. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's also the most important, because I finally understand that the alternative is becoming Danny Bennett, and I'd rather die than let that happen." We sat together in the quiet of my kitchen, 2 people who had found their way back to each other through truth and consequences, and the kind of love that's strong enough to demand accountability. Michael would never get back the wealth and status he had lost, but he was building something more valuable, a life based on his own efforts and choices, rather than his mother's generosity. And I had learned something too, something about the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between protecting someone and controlling them, between being generous and being foolish. I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are painful to watch. 6 months later, Sarah and the children moved back home, not because Michael had proven he was perfect, but because he had proven he was trying. A year later, he started his own small business, funded not with my money but with a bank loan that required him to prove his creditworthiness and business plan to skeptical strangers. The business succeeded, not because it was handed to him, but because he had finally learned the value of hard work and honest dealing. And when it did succeed, when he was able to provide for his family through his own efforts, he called me to share the news not because he needed something from me, but because he wanted someone who loved him to celebrate his achievement. That phone call, more than any apology or promise or demonstration of change, told me that my nephew had finally become the man I had always hoped my son could be. It told me that love, when it's strong enough to include consequences and wise, enough to include truth, really can conquer all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.